The middle class used to feel like the default destination. You worked, you earned more over time, you bought a home, you built stability, you expected life to become more secure as you moved forward. That was the promise, not wealth, not luxury, just traction. But that promise is getting weaker. Across much of the modern economy, people can still work hard, still earn decent incomes, and still feel like stability keeps moving further away. That is what it means for the middle class to shrink. Not only fewer people in the middle, but a middle that becomes harder to enter, harder to maintain, and easier to fall out of. People often explain this in moral terms. People spend too much. They save too little. They chose the wrong degree. They made bad personal decisions. Those things can matter at the individual level, but they do not explain the larger pattern. Because if the middle class were only shrinking because of personal mistakes, the pressure would look random. It doesn't. It looks systematic. Housing gets further away. Insurance gets more expensive. Education costs more. Healthcare remains heavy. Childcare strains budgets. Retirement feels less secure. Wages rise, but large life milestones rise faster. That is not random failure. That is structural compression. The middle class was never just an income band. It was a financial position. A position where work could support housing, family formation, savings, insurance, mobility, and some degree of future confidence. That is important, because the middle class depends less on a number and more on what that number can actually sustain. If income rises, but the cost of security rises faster, the social category weakens even if people are technically earning more. That is why many households feel caught in a strange contradiction. They are not poor, but they do not feel secure. They earn, but they do not build much cushion. They function, but they do not move forward the way previous generations expected to. For a long time, labor income could support more of life directly. A salary could do more. Housing was cheaper relative to income. Education was lighter. Debt burdens were lower. Insurance was less punishing. Essential services absorbed a smaller share of earnings. That did not make life easy, but it made stability more attainable. Now wages often carry a heavier burden, not because people stopped earning, because too many major systems became more expensive at the same time. And when several essential categories rise faster than wages, the middle class does not disappear in one dramatic event. It gets squeezed, slowly, repeatedly, from multiple directions. Housing is one of the clearest reasons the middle class keeps shrinking. When home prices rise faster than incomes, ownership becomes harder to enter. When rents rise, saving becomes harder. When rates rise, monthly payments jump. When insurance rises, the total cost of keeping a home rises too. That matters because housing was one of the main machines of middle-class stability. It provided shelter, but also equity, predictability, and long-term leverage. Once that machine weakens, the middle gets thinner, because people do not only lose a place to live, they lose one of the most important ways ordinary income was turned into long-term security. This is where the issue becomes psychological as well as economic. Middle-class life used to feel expensive, but possible. Now many households feel like they are constantly maintaining normality at a premium. Insurance, utilities, childcare, transport, healthcare, debt payments, subscriptions, education costs, emergency expenses. None of these alone destroys a budget. Together, they create something more dangerous: permanent financial drag. That is how the middle class shrinks without collapse, not through one single shock, but through too many recurring claims on income. The household still functions, but less of its income remains free. Another reason the middle class shrinks is that the economy increasingly rewards ownership more than work. Asset prices rose faster than wages. Homes appreciated faster than incomes. Stocks rose faster than savings. Owners built equity while non-owners faced higher entry costs. That changes the shape of mobility, because the middle class used to be built partly through labor, and then strengthened through ownership. Now labor often struggles to reach ownership at all, which means more households remain dependent on wages alone. in a system where wages no longer keep pace with the assets that create real security. That widens the distance between earning and stability, and that distance is where the middle starts to thin out. When wages stopped carrying the full load, debt expanded to bridge the difference. Student loans, mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, buy now, pay later, home equity borrowing. Debt allowed households to maintain participation in a more expensive economy. That looked sustainable for a while, but debt does not solve structural compression. It delays it. It allows people to preserve a middle-class lifestyle temporarily, while making the system more sensitive later. That matters because debt can protect appearance. You can still consume, still move, still pay, still function. But if more of that normality is being financed, then stability is weaker than it looks, and a thinner middle class often hides behind normal consumption patterns for longer than people realize. The middle class is also shrinking because more risk has been pushed onto households. Work is less secure, benefits are less guaranteed, retirement is more individualized, healthcare costs are more exposed, insurance is less affordable, education is more speculative, housing is more volatile. In older models, institutions absorbed more of that instability. Employers, governments, stronger benefit structures, cheaper public systems, more stable ownership pathways. Now households absorb more directly. That means ordinary life requires more financial resilience just to stay in place. And when households are asked to self-insure against more volatility, the middle becomes harder to sustain. Inflation did not only raise prices, it changed the emotional texture of being middle class. It made ordinary spending feel less reliable, budgeting became more fragile, replacement costs became more uncertain, future planning became harder. Even if wages rose in nominal terms, people often felt poorer in practical terms. That is because the middle class depends heavily on predictability, not just income, but confidence that life's major categories remain manageable. When inflation weakens that predictability, middle-class life feels less secure even before households fall into visible distress. That matters, because shrinking is not only statistical, it is experiential. This is not only an American story, or a British story, or a Canadian story. Different countries experience it differently, but the broader pattern appears across much of the developed world: higher housing pressure, more expensive services, weaker labor-to-ownership conversion, greater household exposure to risk, and a growing gap between income and security. That is why the issue feels bigger than one bad policy or one difficult year. It reflects a deeper shift in how modern economies distribute pressure. The middle class used to be the zone where pressure was absorbable. Now that zone is narrowing. When people hear that the middle class is shrinking, they often imagine a dramatic disappearance. That is not usually what happens. What actually happens is more subtle. The middle becomes thinner, more conditional, more fragile. It takes more income to feel stable, more planning to maintain basics, more debt to preserve normality, more luck to avoid setbacks. So the category still exists, but the cost of remaining inside it rises. That is what shrinking means in practice. Not only fewer people in the middle, a middle that demands more and protects less. The middle class keeps shrinking because too many systems that once supported it now extract from it. Housing extracts more, debt extracts more, insurance extracts more, education extracts more, healthcare extracts more, even convenience extracts more through subscriptions and recurring payments. At the same time, ownership remains harder to reach, and wages carry less power than they once did. That combination is decisive. The middle class weakens when the cost of stability rises faster than the income meant to support it. That is the deeper pattern, not collapse, compression. The middle class does not disappear all at once. It narrows, it stretches, it becomes harder to hold. That is why so many people can still look stable from the outside while feeling increasingly strained underneath. They are not imagining it. The system changed, and when too many essential parts of life become more expensive, more fragile, and more dependent on debt, the middle stops feeling like the center. It starts feeling like a balancing act.